to thank Professor Edwards for that very kind introduction, and thank all of you for coming out to participate today. It's an honor to be part of these Humanities Center talks. I'm always amazed when I look at the schedule at how many really interesting and innovative and groundbreaking researchers we have here at this university in such a wide variety of topics. And so it's an honor to be included among this speaker series, and hopefully we can have some good conversations today. What I'm going to be talking about is it emanates out of the Flint water crisis and some of the realizations that can be made from thinking about the sequence of events that led up to the crisis and that followed the decisions that led to the crisis. And one of the things, soon after this all came to light, I remember talking with people who are government officials who work in public health agencies in different parts of the country. And especially after, as we'll talk about in some detail in a few minutes, there started to be some efforts to hold government officials accountable, and particularly some of the public health officials who had either not intervened quickly enough to highlight the possible presence of lead in the water supply in Flint, or didn't announce to the public in a timely manner that there had been a spike in Legionnaires cases, that they were going to be prosecuted using criminal law. And this is a fairly unusual thing to happen. And I had public health officials that I was talking to say, well, does this mean from now on if we make mistakes and people are harmed, that we're going to face really severe consequences like being prosecuted and maybe being sent to jail on serious criminal charges? And the short answer to that question is, well, no, I don't expect that to happen. But it raised a whole interesting set of issues about how well or how not so well we actually handle accountability for public officials when they make decisions that lead to harm. And one of the things that I think can, I'll sort of give you the end at the beginning of where we eventually get to, I think, in this talk today, is that there were so many opportunities where people could have been held accountable at earlier stages throughout the Flint crisis. And there were missed opportunities, and the systems and the mechanisms that are in place to hold people accountable when they make decisions that cause harm were missed again and again. And there's a variety of reasons why that happened. And because of that vacuum that was created, that kind of accountability that I think we all want to see for people who make decisions that cause harm has really yet to happen. And it's still an ongoing process. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, talk about maybe some of the things we can change to try to make it more likely that the accountability mechanisms that are available are used more effectively in future kinds of situations. Now, where I wanted to start actually is back in 1976. And this will hopefully make sense in a minute why I'm going back to 1976. So in 1976, there was an unexpected scare related to a strain of flu that was circulating in the population. For those of you that are not particularly familiar with flu, it's a viral infection. It spreads very easily. Back in 1918, there was a gigantic flu pandemic that circled the globe and killed approximately 50 million people. And periodically after that 1918 pandemic, there have been certain years where, because the flu virus mutates just a little bit and becomes particularly virulent, you see spikes in numbers of cases and numbers of deaths. And so in 1976, there was a concern that that was going to be one of those years where the flu virus was going to be particularly deadly. And there had been some early cases that had been detected on a military base in New Jersey. There was a concern that the mortality rate was higher than usual. And so what happened was people in the government started talking about, well, what can we do? Now, every year there's a flu vaccine, and the strain of the flu vaccine is tried to, the scientists try to match that strain to the strain that's circulating in the population to have as best fit as possible. And so they quickly put together what they thought was a compatible flu vaccine strain, and they went out and tried to do this rapid nationwide flu vaccination campaign. And so the director of the CDC at the time, whose name was David Sensor, he was the kind of main decision maker, main spokesperson for this national campaign. He was out there in the media talking about how everyone needed to get their flu vaccine. And it was rolled out pretty rapidly. Unfortunately, as sometimes happens, that there were a couple of news stories that were linking people who had gotten the flu vaccine with some adverse reactions. And it was never really demonstrated that the flu vaccine actually caused these problems, but there were a few people who had gotten the vaccine and then they developed symptoms of something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a kind of has neurological type effects. And in the media, this was blamed on the vaccine. People started avoiding the vaccine, refusing to get it. And the public health officials were understandably concerned about this because they didn't want this flu outbreak to get worse. They really wanted people to take the vaccine. And here you see President Gerald Ford getting a flu vaccination in front of the media to support the vaccination program. Now, as it turns out, the flu outbreak that year never happened. Now, why didn't it happen? Maybe it didn't happen because enough people actually got vaccinated that it really curtailed the spread of the disease. Perhaps it didn't happen just because that strain turned out to be not as deadly as was expected. And so it was sort of, it ended up being a normal flu season, which still meant that tens of thousands of people died from the flu, which still happens every year. But it wasn't this gigantic wave of mortality that they were afraid of. But what ended up happening, in addition to there not being a flu epidemic that year, was that David Sensor, the head of the CDC, got fired. The head of HHS, Joseph Califano, asked for his resignation and essentially blamed him for the public relations disaster that was this failed flu vaccination campaign. And there was this widespread concern in the public health community that this was going to set back vaccination campaigns for years because people weren't going to trust vaccines. But in this case, there was a form of accountability. Now, whether it was fair to Dr. Sensor or not, I think is an open question. It doesn't seem like he did anything unreasonable in this situation. But what he did do was he actually he paid a price. He was held accountable. He had been the head of the CDC for about a dozen years at that point, and he was fired. And this is normally the way that things work. And it may be, these decisions may be political decisions. They may be based on good motivations by the people who are making those decisions on accountability. But this is the way that things usually work. Somebody makes a decision, it turns out to be a bad decision or the wrong decision, and they're held accountable for it in some way. Now, I want to stay in 1976 just for one more minute or two. Another thing that happened in 1976 was it was the bicentennial. There were lots of events all around the country, but there were in particular a lot of events in Philadelphia where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. And there were the Legionnaires, who are a big national organization, decided to have their conference in Philadelphia that year at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, a beautiful building right there on the slide. And unfortunately, there was a mysterious illness that breaks out at the convention. And there were over 200 people end up getting sick with this unidentified form of bacterial pneumonia. They don't really know what's causing this. And in fact, there were 29 people who died from this infection. And it turns out that this was a new bacterial infection that hadn't previously been identified. And that's why it was named Legionnaires' disease after the Legionnaires. You really don't want to have a disease named after your organization, but they did. And scientists were able to quickly determine the source of this infection, that it was bacterial, that it was treatable using antibiotics, but that it could also be deadly, especially to people with compromised immune systems. They also found out that it thrives in the water supply. And in fact, this bacteria is present in many, many different water supplies. It's a commonly found bacteria. Most of the time, it doesn't come in such quantities that it infects people easily. But it's something that people who deal in environmental quality and deal in water quality started to be able to test for and to look for in the water supply. Now, the reason Legionnaires is relevant to our story today is in part because of the Flint water crisis. And Legionnaires is kind of the undertold story of the Flint water crisis. Most people have, appropriately so, focused on the lead contamination, but we're going to talk about actually both of those things today. For those of you that haven't been following the Flint crisis closely, I'm sure most of you have some understanding of what happened in Flint, but I just wanted to give you kind of a really quick timeline to kind of set the stage here. So in 2011, the city of Flint was placed under emergency management by the governor of Michigan. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, about how that works and why that's problematic. But essentially, the elected government of the city was displaced by a state-appointed controller who was able to make decisions regarding all financial expenditures the city makes. That emergency there was a sequence of emergency managers, but one of the emergency managers in 2013 decides to take Flint off the Detroit Water and Sewer Department system, which is the water system that serves the Metro Detroit area that had been serving Flint since the late 1960s. That decision was made primarily as a cost-saving measure. The city wanted to save money to spend on other things, although it's actually a more complicated story than that. In April 2014, the water switch happens. One of the things that was set into motion by this decision to move off of the Detroit water system, there was a new pipeline that was being proposed that would bring water directly to Genesee County, where Flint is located, but the new pipeline wouldn't be ready for a number of years. They were still building it, or at least trying to get the financing for building it. And so in the meantime, the emergency manager authorizes a plan to use the Flint River as the water source instead. Now, the Flint River has a lot of industrial contaminants in the water. There was a water treatment plant in Flint that hadn't been used since the 1960s when they had switched over to the Detroit system, and that plant was quickly brought up back online, although not with all of the necessary modifications that were needed to make the water safe. As soon as the switch is made in April 2014, residents of Flint immediately start to see the effects. Start to see, the water was different. It was from a different source. It had, many people reported water that was discolored, brown water. It was not clear. It smelled. It had a funny odor. Was causing all sorts of health concerns, rashes, and other kinds of really negative health effects. And the citizens of Flint brought this to the attention of their elected officials, both at the local and state level. And at least at the state level, for the most part, all they got back was denials that there was any problem. And from the Department of Environmental Quality, which is the state environmental department that's responsible for testing the water supply, they got repeated statements saying the water is safe, it's safe to drink, there's no problems. And as we know now, there were significant problems. So the fact that the water was not being treated to prevent the lead pipes from corroding. Flint has an old water system with lead pipes. And so the water itself started corroding the pipes. Lead was released into the water. Also, Legionnaires bacteria began to thrive within the system. And so as early as October 2014, there is now a spike in Legionnaires cases in Genesee County for people who are exposed to this water. And as early as January of 2015, the head of the state health department is notified about this Legionnaires outbreak, but they don't really do anything with this information in the health department. They just sit on it and talk about doing some additional investigations, but don't notify the public of any increased threat in the water supply. Later in that year, there's updates on a second outbreak. Typically, these outbreaks occur more in warmer weather, so they usually happen over the summer. And really, even though public pressure is starting to mount, and even though there's now some media pressure starting to mount on the government to do something about the safety of the Flint water supply, it really isn't until September of 2015 when Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha publishes her study demonstrating conclusively that there have been elevated lead levels in children who've been exposed to the Flint water, that you really get a sufficient amount of pressure to have the state government officials do anything about this. And so in October of 2015, the Genesee County Health Department declares an emergency. Also in October 2015, the water supply is switched back to the Detroit system. In December of 2015, Robert Skidmore, who was a patient at the McLaren Hospital in Flint dies from Legionnaire's disease. Altogether, there were 12 deaths from Legionnaire's infection. And Robert Skidmore is someone that I wanted to mention specifically because when we come to the criminal cases, his death plays a prominent role in that case. And so then, into 2016, you have the governor finally declaring declaring a state of emergency in Flint and notifying the public of the Legionnaires outbreak as well. And even in the aftermath of this, so there are a couple of things that happen. The governor does convene an independent task force to study what happened, how this had been allowed to happen. And the following year, in 2017, you get charges from the Attorney General's office filing criminal charges against 15 state and local officials who were involved in making decisions related to these crises. Now, and then the case against two of those officials who were charged were people who were in the health department. It was the director of the health department and the chief medical officer for the state who were charged with involuntary manslaughter, among other charges, for not warning the public about Legionnaires' outbreak. The fact that they sat on that information, presumably not because it wasn't sufficiently a serious threat, but because they were trying to avoid more negative attention to the decisions to change the water supply in Flint. And that case now, actually the case against both the director of the department and the chief medical officer are still pending. They've been what's called bound over, meaning they've gone through preliminary hearings and are now moving on to the trial stage in the criminal process. So I think one way to think about this is to think about the Flint water crisis as really a set of interlocking crises. There I think, are at least 6 interlocking crises. And I guess some of these crises are crises that predate the decisions that led to the water contamination. And some of them are effects of that contamination. And so I would say, the first 2 categories, well, I'm going to talk about each one of these and kind of one at a time here. So there are really 2 health crises. One is the crisis related to lead exposure. Thousands and thousands of people in Flint were exposed for a period of about 18 months to water contaminated with a high level of lead. Lead is a very dangerous substance to be exposed to at high levels, especially for children. It has kind of neurotoxic type effects. It can have permanent effects on the brains of children in particular. And so there's quite a lot of concern about the long-term impact on the population's health in Flint from being exposed to this water for such an extended amount of time. The second data point that I wanted to show you here is there have been a number of other studies that have looked at more specific effects of the exposure to the lead-contaminated water. And so, for example, there's a study that looked at birth rates in Flint during the period where the water source was from the Flint River, and it showed that there was a significant decrease in the number of live births. In other words, it was causing pregnant women to lose their pregnancies based on the exposure to the lead in the water supply. And there are, I'm sure, other significant health impacts as well. The tally and the total of those health impacts is something that we're not going to know for a long time. As I already mentioned, there was the Legionnaires outbreak, which infected over 90 people and caused 12 deaths, as far as we know, at least 12 deaths. Most of these cases were patients who were in the McLaren Hospital because there must have been a sufficiently high amount of Legionella bacteria in the water supply there. So those are the 2 health crises. Now, there's also a set of relevant crises that deal with governance and disinvestment and structural racism. And so, and all of these predate the decisions made in Flint. So the governance crisis is primarily about the ability of the state to impose an unelected emergency manager on any jurisdiction it deems to be in financial exigency. And amazingly enough, and some of you may know this, but if you haven't sort of been following this particular issue for a while, there was a law that was passed a number of years ago. It was early in the Snyder administration, the previous governor, and that granted the governor a substantial amount of authority to appoint emergency manager and displace the elected government of any local jurisdiction, whether it be a local government or a local school board. The voters of Michigan actually overturned that at the ballot box. There was a ballot initiative saying, we don't want to permit the governor to do this. So it was overturned, and then the legislature came back and immediately reenacted another law that gave that power back to the governor. So even though the people expressly voted that power down, the legislature immediately restored it. And so you have the sequence of emergency managers in Flint that start in 2011 and go through until 2016. The real problem with this approach and this power is that the emergency managers are completely unaccountable to the population. There's no democratic accountability at all. The emergency manager is accountable to the governor and the state treasurer, and serve at the pleasure of those two. The emergency managers serve at the pleasure of those two officials. Their responsibility is to try to save money and to get the budgetary circumstances of a particular jurisdiction back in order. They are not required, according to the statute, to take in other factors into account. So the health and well-being of the population is not something that they're required to take into account. Now, they're not prohibited from taking those things into account. There's no reason that an emergency manager couldn't take a larger set of considerations into account in making decisions. But the emergency managers in Flint really didn't do that. A contrast might be what happened here in Detroit with the emergency manager, where while there were some problems with how the Detroit bankruptcy proceeded, the emergency manager in Detroit during the bankruptcy did actually take other factors into account besides just the bottom line finances of the city, and I think with better results than we've seen in some other jurisdictions. So this is one of the inherent problems with this approach. It takes any kind of democratic accountability away from that official, and it focuses that official on one thing, the bottom line, to the exclusion of all of the other things that should be taken into account by anyone who's making decisions that affect an entire population. There's also very long-standing crises in Flint and in many other cities of disinvestment and structural racism. So if any of you have ever seen my colleague Peter Hammer talk about this issue, he's written an outstanding article on this topic as well, about how a long history of discrimination, of housing redlining. So that map on the left side there is the 1930s Federal Housing Authority map of Flint, and the areas in red are the areas where they won't give housing loans, and those were, the FHA policies were explicitly discriminatory against African Americans. So if you were African American and you wanted a housing loan from the federal government, which was subsidizing a lot of those loans, you couldn't get it. And so over time, policies like this and policies that promoted school segregation and other discriminatory policies end up not only creating racially segregated neighborhoods in Flint and in many other cities as well, but they also lead to this long-term disinvestment in those communities, because you have, especially with changes in the economic base of the city, with GM reducing its workforce there and other factors like that, you end up with a population living in Flint that tends to be poorer, that tends to have less job opportunities, less transportation and housing opportunities, and the tax base of the city kind of evaporates. People who are wealthier move out of the city to suburban areas. They no longer pay taxes to the city of Flint. The housing, property values go down, which means less property taxes as well, and so you end up with the city with more financial strain. And then the state, of course, goes and changes the revenue sharing formula, which puts even more financial strain on the cities. And so you end up with cities like Flint in really serious budgetary straits, which then justifies imposing an emergency manager, and that perpetuates that cycle. And so So it's a terrible structure that perpetuates and exacerbates the vulnerability of residents of cities like Flint, and makes them even more politically disempowered, so that when there is a real threat to health, they have less ability to use political power to push back against that in a timely way. Okay, so and then my last of the 6 crises, it's the crisis of accountability, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about today. So I mentioned already that there was this initial public outcry when the water supply was switched because of some very obvious physical signs that there was a problem with contamination in the water. But nevertheless, those initial public concerns were dismissed by officials who could do something about it. Eventually, the media really gets more involved and is able to uncover some information. You have scientists who do investigations and uncover that there is contamination that the state officials are denying. There's a whole long story that I'm not going to have time to get into right now about how the EPA was sort of involved in this, and you had scientists from the EPA discovering high lead levels in Flint homes, and then superior officers at the EPA sort of rejecting that report and not sharing it and not publicizing it. And so even within the systems that are supposed to be protective and checks on oversight to make sure that we're ensuring that the water supply is safe, these were breaking down, and there wasn't any mechanism that was functioning well to overcome those breakdowns. There was not an opportunity, well, there were opportunities, but they weren't taken within the government as well. So legislative oversight was not pursued. The Michigan legislature didn't investigate this on their own to try to figure out what was going on. The governor's office was, for the most part, just deferring to the word of several officials within the Department of Environmental Quality. You had also a lot of blame passing about who was even responsible for figuring this out and tracking this. And then, later on, when you have civil lawsuits and criminal prosecutions begin to occur, you also have the state very vigorously pushing back against any kind of accountability through those mechanisms as well. And so the state is vigorously defending against civil suits from individuals who were exposed to lead in Flint. The state is prosecuting some of its own officials, but is also defending those same officials. And so it's really on kind of both sides of that case. But overall, there has still been very little accountability for anyone who was involved in these decisions. And so this led me to think a little bit more about accountability in kind of a bigger picture sense. So what are we trying to achieve when we try to achieve accountability for government officials? I think we're trying to achieve at least 4 different kinds of things. And so here they are. One goal of accountability is to obtain information and to have a culture where there is transparency into why decisions are made, and if those decisions are made in error, to be able to use that information and that transparency to go back and correct that error, either correct it in real time so that it mitigates whatever harm might be caused by that error, or even if you can't turn back the clock, at least have the ability to learn from that mistake so that future decision makers won't make the same mistake. One of the goals of accountability is to have legitimacy and justification for people who are in these positions of power. So, and this is kind of circular, because if you have a system of accountability that works, that makes your government officials more legitimate, because the public can trust the fact that people not only will be incentivized to make good decisions, but that if they make bad decisions, for whatever reason, whether intentionally or unintentionally, there'll be some accountability for those decisions, and therefore they can trust in the legitimacy of that system. And it's circular because the more legitimacy there is, the more likely, accountability fosters legitimacy, and the more legitimate the officials are in the eyes of the public, the more they're able to actually achieve those means of accountability. And then the last 2 categories I think are probably the most important. demonstrating responsibility or answerability of public officials to the population as a whole. Accountability allows officials to be made to answer for their actions and to be held responsible for them when they make mistakes. And finally, in some cases, depending on the type of mistakes we're talking about, accountability allows for enforcing the law, sanctioning people, and there's a whole wide range of sanctions that might be available. It might be firing the person, like we talked about in the first example back at the beginning of our hour here today. Or it could be criminal prosecution. It could be civil liability, paying damages to people who are harmed. So another way to think about this, so instead of just thinking about the goals, you can think about what are the tools of accountability. Well, there are lots of tools of accountability, and very few of them are actually used effectively related to Flint. So I kind of broke this down into a two-column table here, and generally speaking, some of the tools are tools that are internal to the government. So you can have informal internal tools. So within departments, procedures for evaluating whether decisions that are being made using scientific evidence, are being made with some kind of chain of reporting where people can double check each other's decision making. Because some of these decisions are political decisions, some of the informal tools might not always work. You have more formal tools, including firing someone, or if it's an elected official, impeaching that elected official. You have, although impeachment is really an external tool because it's the population that would be, it could be done by the legislature, and then you can have recalls done by the population. So there are a couple of different options here. Legislative oversight, having the legislature oversee the actions of the executive branch officials, which was actually very underutilized in this example. And I'm going to be speaking at the law school next week and focusing a little bit more on that aspect of this situation. Formal investigations. This was actually done related to the Flint crisis. So you had an independent committee that was formed that actually did, in my opinion, an outstanding job of identifying the breakdowns that led to the poor decisions, and put a lot of the blame on the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the officials in that department. The problem is that as powerful and as important as that independent investigation, that task force was, nothing ever happened with their recommendations. So the recommendations were made. They made good recommendations for how to fix the system, for how to hold people accountable for their errors and not let them happen again. And so far, most of those have just been completely unacted on. Now, they still could be acted on, but so far there hasn't been much movement. And part of that was because until recently, it was the same administration in power who was less, they didn't have a strong incentive to act on those changes because it would implicate them and potentially, they had a political interest in not reacting quickly. External options for tools are things like democratic accountability, so voting someone out of office, for example. Civil lawsuits and criminal prosecutions, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And then informal tools, external. Public advocacy, media scrutiny, using information and community strength to try to highlight issues and force public officials to act. Now, as we saw in Flint, I mean, ultimately this was what got people to act, was the organization within the community. It was independent investigations, and it was the media, and it was scientists doing work to try to highlight the problems because the state wasn't doing it. But it took too long, and part of the reason that it took so long was because of some of the dynamics I was talking about before, that you have a population in Flint that has been disempowered for a whole lot of different reasons. And I guarantee you that if there was lead in the water in Bloomfield Hills or in Grosse Pointe, that problem would be solved in about a week. And that indicates one of the big underlying issues here. So, because I'm getting a little bit short on time, I'm not going to talk about each one of these in great depth, but I did want to highlight a few specific things. We're thinking about these tools. So the external is, I'm kind of going to go around that chart in kind of a counterclockwise way. The external informal accountability methods. I think one lesson we can take out of the Flint crisis is that we have to be really willing to embrace the value of community input and take community complaints, take community concerns very seriously, and much more seriously than we did in this situation. The media also plays a large role here because they can really highlight and amplify these concerns and bring them to the attention of the public and to officials who can hopefully make more rapid changes. From the internal informal accountability category, there are ways that we can structure our agencies to make them better at self-correcting for mistakes. Now, I think one of the issues that maybe I haven't said enough about yet related to the Flint situation is that a lot of what was driving the reluctance of the state to change its position was that I think there were certain decision makers who were very entrenched and were not willing to admit that they had done anything wrong. They were trying to cover their own interests, I would say, and so when there's sort of a political underpinning to the reason for the decision, and you're trying to either avoid responsibility or avoid negative political consequences, it's harder to overcome bad decisions, and especially when the leadership at a particular government agency is unwilling to be open and transparent and examine its own pre-existing decision making. But there are ways that you can have systems in place that have better practices of that kind of review. In terms of internal formal accountability, I think that different employment sanctions, firing people, demoting them, reassigning them, even just having reprimands on their record that can result in additional training. Those are all techniques that could be used. They were not used in this situation. Having internal investigations and oversight within the executive branch are also important. Having inspectors general or ombudspersons who are established within agencies, who are structured in a way that they're independent from the decision makers. They can field complaints from members of the community and concerns, and they can act on them and investigate them independently and have a check on the decisions being made by agency officials. And there are many agencies that had these kinds of positions. We didn't have them in place, and they weren't utilized here in Michigan. And then legislative oversight. As I said before, the legislature has substantial power to have hearings, to request information from executive agencies, to try to have an additional level of a check over what the agencies are doing, and here this was not used either. And then finally, you have your external formal accountability. Obviously, I think there was some external formal accountability in the sense that the Republican leadership in the state all got voted out in the last election cycle. And so that's maybe a belated example of electoral accountability. I don't think that was solely due to Flint. It was due to a lot of factors. But I'm sure that Flint was one of the substantial factors why there was such a level of democratic political success at the state level in the last election cycle. That being said, the last two categories are the ones that I think are the most unusual in terms of this case. And so, and that's the civil litigation and the criminal prosecution. So in terms of having accountability through civil litigation, for those of you that are not law students, I don't think very many of you are law students, so I'll spend a little bit of time explaining what I mean here. So under the tort system, you can bring a civil claim against someone who you allege has harmed you. And so there are many dozens of lawsuits that were filed by residents of Flint who have been exposed to lead and also lawsuits filed by family members of people who had died from Legionnaires infections. And these lawsuits were filed against a wide range of different defendants. They were filed against state officials and the state itself. They were filed against some private entities, including the contractors that were responsible for doing work on the Flint water plant and making recommendations for how the water should or should not be treated. And so all of these lawsuits have been proceeding for a couple of years now. Now, one of the big challenges in bringing civil lawsuits against government officials is that there's substantial immunity available to government officials. And so we have, the way the system is set up is that typically a government official who is sued by a member of the public for a decision that they make in their official capacity can deflect that suit and has an immunity defense saying, well, you can't, and the reason that these provisions were put into place, I mean, some of it goes back to sort of the ancient traditions of the common law where, you could not sue the king. And we adopted that common law system. Obviously we have no king, but we have government officials that retain that immunity, especially at the state level. Now, you can overcome the immunity defenses, especially if you've had a fundamental right violated, if you've had, without getting into all the technical details, basically, this is a pretty high bar to meet because you have to demonstrate not only that your fundamental right has been violated, or that you've had that there's been a violation of your substantive due process, but you also have to be able to show that this is a right that was established, well established, and that the state official it would be well established enough that the state official would know not to transgress that right. And so there was a lot of concern that most of these civil lawsuits would end up getting dismissed. And somewhat surprisingly, some of the suits have succeeded in not getting dismissed. Doesn't mean they'll ultimately succeed. We still don't know. But there was a decision just about a month ago in federal court which upheld a number of the claims from individual residents of Flint against state officials in the Department of Environmental Quality and some of the emergency managers. And that decision found that the people bringing the lawsuits had stated a sufficient claim that their fundamental right of bodily integrity had been violated by the decisions to switch the water to the Flint River. And so if those suits go through the whole process and succeed, I think that's going to be really important because it'll be a rare example of a decision like this being allowed to result in an award to individuals from the harm they suffered from an official government decision. Now, connected to that are the criminal cases, and these I think are even more unusual because typically you don't see criminal charges against state officials for this kind of decision. Usually when you see criminal charges against state officials, it's because they were engaged in some kind of bribery scheme or some kind of corruption, self-dealing type scheme. And so, a great example of this is there was a case where you had a public official who worked for I think it was for the Detroit Health Department, who was a lead inspector, who was going around and essentially taking bribes from landlords to write reports that their lead was within acceptable levels. That person was caught. That's just straight up corruption, taking bribes for an official act, and that person ended up with about 5 years in prison. That's the kind of case we usually see against public officials, corruption case. These charges are very different. Here, what the charges are saying is, you violated your duty to protect the public's well-being. One of your core responsibilities as an elected official is to use your position of authority to protect the public's health, to protect public safety, by egregiously ignoring the risk, this very substantial risk to the public, by switching its water supply without treating the water, without taking basic precautions, by not notifying the public of a spike in a dangerous disease because you didn't want more bad publicity. That is not just a dereliction of your official duty. And there are some criminal charges that are essentially things like the abuse of office, which means that you didn't comply with what you were supposed to do as an office holder. But some of these officials also were charged with involuntary manslaughter. Now, involuntary manslaughter is a very serious criminal charge. It's a felony. It comes with potentially substantial prison time. And as far as I know, I don't think anyone in a public role has ever been charged with involuntary manslaughter for making a decision that led to harm to people in the community. I've not been able to find other cases in the United States of this ever happening before. And so this is really novel ground that we're on. And in part, I think there are kind of two reasons why these prosecutions have been so aggressive and so kind of envelope pushing. One reason, I think, is because there is a political dynamic to it, and these charges were originally brought by Bill Schuette when he was Attorney General, and some of that is he was trying to distance himself from Governor Snyder. He was running for governor himself at the time, so I think that was one of the main factors of taking a really aggressive stance to sort of show that he was trying to get some kind of accountability for residents of Flint. The second reason, and the one that I think is probably even maybe a little bit more on point, is that there was just a vacuum of accountability. I mentioned all these other ways that could have been pursued to try to get accountability through these different mechanisms. None of them were being successfully pursued. None of them were being effective. And so into this vacuum steps the criminal law, and you get these fairly substantial charges being brought. Now, these cases are still pending. I don't know how they're going to come out, whether the people charged with these crimes will end up being prosecuted, or if they end up getting convicted, whether it'll be for involuntary manslaughter or some lesser charge. If I had to predict, I would say the lesser charges are more likely. But I think this really demonstrates how complicated it can be to get accountability, to hold people responsible, and to come up with some kind of appropriate level sanction when this kind of harm is inflicted. I'm going to skip a couple of slides and try to wrap things up, because I know we're getting near the end of the time. So, some implications. And some of these implications I think are directly connected to the criminal prosecutions, and some are broader than that. So I do think that this case is very unusual in the sense that the decisions that the officials made so clearly directly led to the harm. In most cases, it's a little more ambiguous, and so at the very beginning I said there were all these public health officials who were saying, well, now if I make a mistake, am I going to be prosecuted? I really don't think that's going to happen. I think this will set some precedent, and I think you might see some prosecutors being interested in these kinds of cases. But I don't think this is going to fundamentally change the overall trend, and I don't think we're going to start seeing, for example, health officials being prosecuted anytime an outbreak happens, for example. But if they had information and they withheld it, maybe they will be, and so that strikes a lot of fear in public officials, and they say, well, how are you going to get people to serve in these jobs if they're going to be prosecuted if they make mistakes? Well, what's being alleged here isn't that they made mistakes, it's that they had information and they withheld it intentionally with reckless results. A second issue is, I think the causation here is also kind of hard. So if you don't warn people of an outbreak, who's responsible for the death? Is it the person, is it a specific official, is it just the head official of the agency? Is it anyone in the chain of authority who could have warned the public? Is it the person at the state level or the person at the local level? Is it all of those people? And so I think it raises some really tough questions about who is actually responsible and who's the appropriate person to put the sanction on. And when you use criminal law for this purpose, it makes it even, I think, a little more challenging. I think it also creates potentially some strange incentives. So if there is this threat of criminal prosecution, how does that change the behavior of public health officials? And are those changes positive or not? In some respects, they might be, because it might just make officials more transparent. It might mean that they're extra eager to share potential threat information with the public because they're concerned about withholding anything that might later on be seen as making them culpable for harm. On the other hand, if public health officials are just sharing every bit of potential risk information with the public every single day, people might stop paying attention to that. It might actually undermine their credibility, it might undermine their legitimacy to the point where people stop paying attention, and when there's a real risk, they are less effective in spreading that message. Okay, so I also think that if some of these other approaches to accountability are used, you're much less likely to need the prosecutions, because the criminal law doesn't necessarily need to get involved because you have other effective means that might be a lot more direct. One of the things about any kind of litigation, whether you're talking about the civil lawsuits or the criminal prosecutions, is that it's a very long process, and it's a very uncertain process. The people who are seeking some kind of solace that people have been held accountable are going to have to wait a really long time, and then in the end they might not even get what they want, and so it can be very unsatisfying as well, especially if the cases ultimately don't succeed, and it's also a very high cost. I mentioned before that the state prosecuting these cases is on both sides of the case, right? They're prosecuting state officials, they're defending state officials, they're spending millions of dollars on legal fees. It would be great if those millions of dollars actually could go to the city of Flint to help repair infrastructure and help the residents with other needs that they have. And so, stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, sometimes efforts at accountability and focusing on individuals and bad decisions they made in the past might actually not be the best use of our time and resources. Perhaps we should be thinking about how to really put resources in to solve the problems going forward, and also to prevent them from happening again in the future. And this is my last point here, is that there's a lot of room to achieve accountability in a better way. I think there are a lot of mechanisms that are underutilized here, and so we should take lessons from that and try to build those lessons into our governing structures so that we can achieve better accountability in the future. And if you have, if you want to read more about this, I did publish an article that focuses on the prosecutions in particular, which is that top article there. The lower article, it hasn't come out yet, but will come out soon, and looks more at some of the bigger picture issues of restoring trust and accountability in the aftermath of these kinds of decisions. But I don't know if we have any time for questions, or I talked all the way up until the very end. So, but I'm not in a rush, so I'll stick around if anyone has questions. Sure. I'll be happy to answer them.
Well, kind of a comment. It would seem to me this is a wonderful risk management opportunity for governance to take a look at different departments around the country. For instance, Amtrak, with government here, with public health, to say the Flint and the Amtrak, if Amtrak has a similar pathway with lawsuits, that if you are in a position of public, let's say, leadership, you could be accountable for bad outcome, just like in healthcare, we have malpractice.
Yeah.
So to me, as terrible as this all is, if anybody is really thinking about what do we do in the future, risk management is the way to go. To say, okay, you're now in the Department of Environmental Quality, you have a responsibility for the future, not just the present. And what you do or don't do potentially could be held accountable to you based on what's currently going on in Flint. And that's an opportunity that could be basically around the country.
Yeah.
Would you agree, do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think your point is a very good one. I think that I'm not sure the best way to kind of get there, but I do think one thing that has come out of the Flint Crises, I think that it's opened a conversation about environmental justice, and it's opened a conversation about some self-serving decision-making in state and local government. But I think it's also opened the door to a discussion about having better systems that will incentivize public officials to make decisions that really are in the best interest of the public and not necessarily, and I mean that's one of the underlying stories here, is that these decisions were made not with the interests of the public in mind. They were made with, we want to save money and we want to, help our friends get this new pipeline built, and this is one way to, I mean, I would really recommend Peter Hammer's article about the water pipeline. I could send you the site to it, but essentially one of the things that was going on behind the scenes as all this was happening was you had, by Flint agreeing to be part of this new water system, they were able to get bond financing that they wouldn't have gotten without Flint coming on board. And so there was pressure from the state government to say, oh, we need Flint to sign on to this. So emergency manager, you should sign on to this so we can get around the normal bond rules and get the financing for this other pipeline, which is something we want to do. And it had nothing to do with the benefit or the potential risk to the people living in Flint. It all had to do with other financial considerations at the state level. And so I think that they're, it's hard to completely avoid those kinds of political decision making, the political decision making that goes on in a variety of ways and at a variety of levels. It's hard to avoid that even with better systems. But I think that what we can learn from this is that there are multiple ways to try to have better oversight throughout the process, and to really hopefully incentivize better decision making that takes into account health of the population as opposed to other factors.
Yes. As a social worker and community activist, I was involved with the Flint issue. The concern that I have now, and I really appreciate the presentation, in terms of the legislative body not being a more active piece in this part. What's currently, Flint is still going on with this crisis now. What's currently, is our current AG looking at it, or have they discussed it, even though we got all these cases lingering?
The answer is I don't know what they're going to do yet. I mean, they're still relatively new enough that I know there have been a few changes in terms of personnel who are overseeing some of the different cases that are pending, both the civil and the criminal cases. But I don't know what the timeline is, and I don't know if the new administration has changed any of their positions on how they're reacting to these lawsuits. So for example, one thing they could do is they could say, we're just going to settle all the lawsuits from the residents of Flint where they sued the state. To my knowledge, they haven't made that kind of statement that they're going to do that, but they could do that. And there are some other, obviously the legislature is still controlled by the Republicans, and so I don't think they're still unlikely to do legislative oversight. But I think because the executive branch has changed over to Democrats, I think there might be some, I think there will be some more supportive programs for Flint, and I expect that to happen. How that affects the pending litigation, I don't know though, and so they do have options, but they haven't really said yet what they're going to do. Yeah. Paul?
Well, I think in response to your question, I don't know if you were talking about criminal liability or civil liability. I think criminal liability is deeply problematic based on pure negligence and without intent. And civil liability, I think you run into the issue is, I think most people at that high level are indemnified by the state or have something like that. And sweeping that aside is, who's going to want to do those jobs if they suffer or are potentially liable for criminal and civil liability? I mean, it's not like even really well people like corporate CEOs or COOs are indemnified, and you're talking about a job that pays, what, 10% of what a corporate person would do? I don't think somebody would put their personal assets at risk.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that a lot of the public health officials that I've talked to about this have made. They say, well, if I'm suddenly going to be facing criminal penalties, if I'm not careful enough, or if I make the wrong decision, and of course, some of it really depends on where you set that bar. I think the situation here is factually very different than the situation you get in most of the scenarios that I hear from the public health officials, where they say, well, okay, there's a judgment call as to whether to recommend the large vaccination campaign, and I decided not to do it, and there was an outbreak. Am I now responsible for every death that occurred in that outbreak? And I don't think that's the kind of situation you're going to have here. But maybe what this precedent does is it makes them think extra hard about that decision not to go ahead and say, well, maybe I should err on the side of precaution because there might be ramifications for me, but also because there might be ramifications for them. So hopefully it just makes for more extended deliberation about these kinds of decisions, and so that they're not. And here the real issue, I think, was, at least with the public health officials, was that at least some of the allegations seem to suggest, and some of the evidence seems to suggest, that the reason they didn't warn the public about the Legionnaires outbreak was because there was already all this negative news about the lead in the water, and they didn't want another thing coming down. And so whether they were told that explicitly by someone in the governor's office, or they did it on their own sort of instinctively to kind of protect politically the people in the administration, it seems like that motivation is clearly very problematic, and we want to disincentivize that kind of thing. And I think that's very different from the scenario where it's a judgment call and an official is making a decision that ends up being wrong and ends up harming people, but the decision was a reasonable assessment of the facts and the situation, however you determine that to be. So, yeah.
I would agree. Also, all of those public health officials and so forth are acting under budgetary constraints. And how careful they can be in what studies is, they don't have unlimited budgets to do that. It has to be appropriated by the legislature. And so it is different than corporate liability in that respect.
Well, this is still a very difficult set of circumstances because, for instance, I was just reading that PG&E in California had a tower that was 25 years beyond its lifetime. It was cracked. It was identified as being deficient. They didn't do anything about it, and that's the tower that started the Paradise Fire. So, I mean, it's sort of like we're between a rock and a hard place here. And so, PG&E has been responsible for a significant number of fires according to what's in the New York Times. So, and here we have Flint, Amtrak. A friend of mine's daughter was killed in the Amtrak Philadelphia crash. So, this is a pretty serious set of circumstances that affect us. I don't have answers. To me, the law is a kind of complicated area. I'm only a psychologist. I don't deal with the law.
I thought the psyche is very complicated.
It is. Well, you look at us and we look at you attorneys and we struggle with all of this. I don't have answers. You bring up wonderful points. And it remains to be seen where we go. Because indemnity sort of takes away personal accountability, and I understand it, and yet we suffer. We suffer.
Yeah,
I don't have answers.
And the only additional thing I'll add is that, a lot of the examples that you just mentioned, I mean, they're all basic infrastructure issues, right? You're thinking about
infrastructure.
How do we maintain the infrastructure of our society in a way that doesn't endanger people. Now, it's probably impossible given the resources to solve every kind of problem like this, but I mean, the Flint situation is one that was easily avoidable, so easily avoidable, and that's what makes it so catastrophic and so devastating, because I mean, this was something that could have been avoided so easily, either by not changing the water supply in the first place, or even if they did change it, by treating it they could have treated the water with an additive that cost about $200 a day that would have largely stopped the lead leaching from the pipes. Now, I mean, the fact that they didn't do that it's devastating, and so I think the large scale infrastructure issues are ones that we need to have a big conversation about nationally, and think about how we invest in those types of things. The biggest issue of all, which is coming down the road not too long, is going to be climate change, which is going to cause so many more health harms, and is going to require such a change to our infrastructure.
There is that lawsuit of all the kids around the country. It's moving along, 4 years in duration, but it's actually overcome a couple of hurdles.
It is, yeah.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you.